Hi Year 11, this is just a quick revision video that is going to focus on Macbeth, and it's going to focus specifically on the use of the motif of the birds that Shakespeare uses throughout the play of Macbeth. I'm just going to talk, there are quite a few references to birds within Macbeth, but I'm just going to talk through just a few of them. So as you can see, on that slide, there is a long list of birds. This list is really important because these are actually in order of how they appear in the play. So what's really interesting to note about this list of birds is that the majority of them are birds of prey, and are birds of ill omen, so associated with negative superstitions, and the vast majority on there are hunters. These birds are associated with Macbeth, so both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth's intentions, actions, and consequences. So the use of the imagery of the birds is often used by other characters that are talking about Macbeth or Lady Macbeth and their actions. So the first bird that I'm going to talk about is the eagle. So we've got a quote here, and it's from Act 1, Scene 2, and it's told through the perspective of the sergeant, and he is describing how Macbeth has fought so bravely and gallantly in his battle. The quote says, "As sparrows, eagles, or the hare, the lion." Just putting this quote into context, the sergeant is describing the actions of Macbeth, and he is saying that the sparrows essentially feared the eagle. So he is comparing Macbeth to an eagle, and he is also suggesting that the sparrows are the enemies that Macbeth and Duncan have slain. So straight away from Act 1, Scene 2, the imagery of the birds are embedded already. So we're going to talk through now the significance really of the eagle, and we're going to think about how an eagle was sort of known back in the Jacobean era and people's thoughts and ideas and views towards an eagle. So as stated previously, the sparrows are representative and they symbolise the enemies that Macbeth and Duncan have slain. So in terms of the religious context of this bird, the eagle has symbolic links to the Bible, and it was often sort of believed that the eagle was symbolic of being close to heaven. So just contextualising this point as it is, Macbeth is being described initially as the eagle. The eagle is believed to have also been the most regal bird in the great chain of being. So, Macbeth has fought and he's sort of deserved the title, and he's deserving he's very well deserved of the heroism that people are linking to his character because of his fight in the battle. Another interesting point is that going back to sort of literature and mythology, there is a story that links an eagle to Zeus, who is a Greek god. And there is this story that when Zeus fought one of his battles and Zeus was heroic, he saw an eagle, and it's sort of an omen that's sort of favourable in victory. So we could be sort of linking here the character of Zeus and Macbeth both being very powerful sort of leaders at the beginning of the play, and both being heroic and sort of deserving their titles through their own actions and their own rights, which is through being, the greatest warriors. And as well, often eagles are associated with historical kingship. So a lot of imagery that we see in history of kings, they often might have eagles associated with their coat of arms, or something with their name. It might have a symbol of an eagle on it. When you look at sort of armour and things like that, there is often depictions of eagles that have been sort of embedded into armour of leaders. So at this point in time, we are associating Macbeth being that really powerful bird, that really regal and sort of symbolic bird of victory and kingship. Now, it's important to note at this point in time, Macbeth hasn't actually secured his kingship, but he's been sort of identified as being brave and being gallant and being an absolute warrior in his own right. Moving on to the raven, this is a really interesting motif that often keeps reoccurring, the reoccurring image of the raven. Lady Macbeth often talks about raven. So this is a quote from Lady Macbeth. So the raven himself that crooks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. So this is actually a quote that Lady Macbeth says as Duncan is arriving at the castle to stay the night as a guest. We all know what fate Duncan is going to sort of see during this scene, and we're sort of seeing that plot being planned out and essentially embedded through the character of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. Now, it's interesting the fact that Lady Macbeth is using the image of a raven. So going back to a contextual point about the Jacobean era, people often associated the raven to be a scavenging bird that people were quite disgusted in and disliked. It's a bird that's also linked to death. We see ravens often depicted when something's died. Again, the raven is a hunter. It eats off bodies of their prey, which links nicely to the point and the prophecy that's embedded in the by the witches in Act 1, Scene 1. It's the imagery behind this quote that's really important. We've got that foreshadowing of death, and that's coming from Lady Macbeth. So the fact that, you know, as a Jacobean audience watching this play, Lady Macbeth is talking about the raven, so already people would have these really quite prominent superstitions about this bird, and the sort of themes that and sort of emotions that people associate with this bird. They're often described as being selfish and disobedient. So again, there are a couple of quotes within Macbeth where the raven is used as an image. You know, could there be a bit of a link here about perhaps Lady Macbeth and Macbeth being symbolic of a raven? They are selfish and disobedient and are associated with death. And another interesting point is that also, again, it's sort of said to have been a belief that ravens can sense death. So this totally makes sense in the context that Lady Macbeth is speaking about this raven as Duncan is arriving at the castle. It links to that whole concept of the foreshadowing. You know, Duncan's death is about to happen, and the use of the raven is really highlighting that specifically through the concept of death. There's another interesting point about the raven as well. It's another biblical reference, and it goes back to Noah and his ark. I'm sure you're all aware of the biblical story of Noah to some extent or another. So there's an interesting story about the ark. The raven was the first bird that Noah released from his ark, and the raven disobeyed Noah. It never returned to his ark. So this links to the whole sort of really sort of negative sort of impression and the sort of ill omen interpretation that we have of that raven. It's a bird that's deceitful. It's a bird that's disobedient, it's a bird that's selfish, and all these characteristics are what we can associate with Macbeth and also Lady Macbeth. So moving on to the next bird is the Mallet. Now this is a bird that you may have, you may not have heard of this bird before, but I'll just introduce the quote and then we'll go into this in a little bit of a more of an in-depth analysis. So it's Banquo that says this about Duncan, and Banquo refers to Duncan as being the temple haunting Mallet. So the Mallet links to the theme of deception. So the Mallet, traditionally, it's a tiny swallow. It's also known as a house martin, and it prefers to build its nest in a house, or as Duncan states, a church, a temple. So there's a sort of great irony within Duncan's speech. This bird is quite deceptive as well. It's deceptive on appearance, so it is associated with good fortune and divinity, but it's a bird that often can become confused. It's symbolic of happiness and good fortune, and it's supposed to have traditionally avoided dwellings of negativity and evil. Now, this is really, really interesting, and there's quite a number of interpretations that you can take from this quote alone. Is Duncan the temple haunting Mallet? Is he unknowingly about to make home in a place that he seems to be sort of quite comfortable and not negative or evil? Is he being deceived in that way? Or can we associate the Mallet more to Lady Macbeth or Macbeth's character, in the sense that it's more sort of the deceptive route that we are going down to, and the fact that they can sort of be perceived as being something quite attractive but be incredibly dangerous? Is that symbolic more to the character of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth in terms of the deception that they are about to sort of lay down on Duncan himself? Another historical and contextual point that is really, really interesting is that Shakespeare only talks about the Mallet in one other play that he wrote, which is The Merchant of Venice. Now, I'm not going to sort of go into much detail about in terms of the plot of The Merchant of Venice, but all you need to be associated with is that one of the characters in The Merchant of Venice is ultimately doomed, and it links quite nicely to the fact that we have got Duncan, that he's doomed, and also the character from The Merchant of Venice. So, my first initial thought is, is Duncan the one that's been deceived through this sort of imagery of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth possibly acting out as the ravens? Is Duncan more the Mallet within this play? Like I said, that's just my interpretation, but you can sort of develop your own. What is really interesting in the final act of Macbeth, Macbeth actually says, as the army is pretty much approaching the castle, Macbeth knows that he is ultimately doomed. He says, "I cannot fly." So that is such a powerful quote in terms of linking the imagery of the birds right from the beginning. It's embedded right until the end. So if we just explore that simple quote in much more detail, going back to Macbeth, originally being described as the eagle in Act 1, Scene 2, the eagle is now being grounded. He cannot fly. He cannot flee. He cannot leave this situation. Therefore, ultimately, he is doomed, and he knows that he is, he's going to meet his demise. But he says that he's going to fight bear-like until the end. Now, this is another interesting point. Often, sort of in traditions, in terms of fights and bear fights, often they removed the claws and teeth of bears, and they often sort of made them fight against dogs. So obviously removing the claws and the teeth from the bear, that bear is essentially lost its power. So the fact that Macbeth is describing himself as being bear-like, I think there is in one of the film adaptations, I think it's the Roman Polanski version, you actually see the actual image of a bear within the film, which sort of embeds this theme quite obviously. But I think removing the claws and the teeth from bear is essentially removing its power. So obviously at this point in time, Macbeth has lost his power. He has lost, he's lost all ability to, become king. Is about to be overturned by Macduff. But he is still fighting like a bear until the end. To summarise the motif of the birds, it's Macbeth's fall from grace that is symbolic through the use of the birds. So in more detail, and going through this sort of list of the birds in chronological order, is referred to as an eagle, then an owl, then a bat, then an owl, and then a hellkite. All are associated with evil. I think that what Shakespeare is doing through the use of this motif is sort of arguing the fact that the motif for nature and the natural order is predominantly shown through the use of the birds. The birds are echoing the humanity that we see within the play through the use of the birds, which, going back to the first slide and the list of the birds that we see in chronological order, the birds are associated with Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's intentions, actions, and consequences. So I think that Shakespeare is doing that to show that it's the humanity and the perhaps the misuse of power, and sort of the power of the birds are symbolic of that fall in his humanity himself. And it's all about, always remembering to link this to a contextual factor, that people's beliefs and the superstition about these birds were really, really powerful. All have a negative connotation to some extent or another. All are birds of prey, and all are birds of ill omen. Even the owl has sort of, if in terms of the context behind that, people's belief that the owl also was a bird that people detested and disliked. Sometimes we often see owls depicted with witches, so that sort of embeds that point. So this is something that would be a good theme to follow up on, especially if you get an extract that has a motif of a bird within it. Can you link that to Macbeth's character? And this specific quote, or the specific order of the birds, the eagle, the owl, the bat, and then the hellkite, are all associated with the demise. The positive sort of imagery that we get with the eagle being associated with kingship that he was originally described as at first, and then we see all these sort of quite negative birds that have that theme of deception, of death. He is associated with those images therefore after. So I hope you found this useful. If you'd like to make a revision card, you can go back through this lesson. I will also upload a practice question that also specifically has a image of a bird within the extract. So perhaps this is something that you could try and practice within an exam response. Thank you for listening. I will upload the resources and attach it to this alongside this revision video. Thank you for listening.